Chapter 1. You don't choose to be born. You just are. And your birth is your destiny, some say. I say the hell with that. And I should know. I was born not just once, but 5 times. And 5 times I learned the same lesson. Sometimes in life, you have to grab your so-called destiny by the throat and wring its neck. My Japanese name is Masaji Ishikawa, and my Korean name is Do Chansun. I was born, for the first time, in the neighborhood of Mizunokuchi in the city of Kawasaki, just south of Tokyo. It was my misfortune to be born between 2 worlds, to a Korean father and a Japanese mother. Mizunokuchi is an area of gently sloping hills that now grows crowded on the weekends with visitors from Tokyo and Yokohama seeking an escape from the city and some fresh air. But 60 years ago, when I was a child, it consisted of little more than a few farms, with irrigation canals that led from the Tama River running between them. Back then, the irrigation canals were used not just for farming, but also for household tasks like laundry and washing dishes. As a boy, I spent long summer days playing in the canals. I'd lie in a big washtub and float on the water all afternoon, basking in the sunshine and watching the clouds cross the sky. To my child's eye, the slow movement of those drifting clouds made the sky look like a vast expanse of sea. I wondered what would happen if I let my body drift with the clouds. Could I cross the sea and reach a country I'd never known, never even heard of? I thought of endless opportunities in my future. I wanted to help poor people, families like mine, become richer so that they could have the means to enjoy their lives. And I wanted the world to be peaceful. I dreamed one day that I would be the Prime Minister of Japan. How little I knew. I used to climb a nearby hill and catch beetles in the early morning dew. At festival time, I'd follow the portable shrine and the dance with the lion's mask. All my memories are sweet. My family was poor, but my childhood days in Mizunokuchi were the happiest of my life. Even now, when I think about my hometown, I can't stop the tears from welling up. I would give anything to go back to that happy time, to feel so innocent and full of hope once more. On the outskirts of Mizunokuchi, there used to be a village, home to 200 or so Koreans. I found out later that most of them had been more or less dragged over from Korea to work in the nearby munitions factory. My father, Do Samdal, was one of them. Born on a farm in the village of Bongchonri, in what is now South Korea, he was commandeered, effectively kidnapped, at the age of 14 and brought to Mizunokuchi. But I didn't even know I had a father until I started elementary school. I have no earlier memories of him whatsoever. In fact, I first became conscious of my father's existence when my mother took me to a strange place, which I later discovered was a prison, to visit a man I didn't recognize. That's the day my mother told me who my father was. Eventually, the man I'd seen through the window in the visitor's room showed up at our house. He was notorious in the area for being a rough fellow, and our relatives shunned him. He was hardly ever at home, but whenever he was there, he spent the better part of his time slugging back strong-smelling liquor. He could polish off a couple liters of sake in short order. What was worse, drunk or not, he'd hit my mother whenever he was at home. My sisters were so frightened, they used to cower in the corner. I tried to stop him by clinging to his leg, but he always kicked me away. My mother tried not to cry out, so she bore the pain with clenched teeth. I felt helpless and scared for her, but could do nothing. As time went on, I just did my best to stay out of his way, which wasn't hard since he never paid much attention to me. But it crossed my mind more than once that I'd come after him when I grew up. My mother's name was Miyoko Ishikawa. She was born in 1925. Her parents ran a shop on the corner of the ancient shopping street, where they sold chickens. My grandmother, Hatsu, ran the shop, and her work was difficult and dirty. The chicken meat wasn't neatly cut up and packaged as it is today. Nothing like that. Cages were strewn higgledy-piggledy in front of the shop, and when a customer appeared, my grandmother would remove a squawking chicken from its cage and slaughter it on the spot. My grandmother suffered from asthma, so she often had coughing fits. Whenever she spotted me coming home from school or from playing somewhere, she'd arch her back and say, "Mabo, can you rub my back?" So I'd stroke and massage her small back for a few minutes. During those times together, she always said to me, "You're a kind boy. You mustn't be like your father. I just can't understand why your mother made the mistake of marrying him." I could see why she used the word mistake. The Ishikawa family was respected and went back a long way in the area. There were many branches of the Ishikawa family in Mizonokuchi. They and the rest of the local people formed a close-knit community. My grandfather, Shokichi, died before I was born, but I was always told he was a good and gentle man who looked after his family and others in his community. He sent my mother to a girls' high school and encouraged her to learn how to sew. Though the family couldn't be called wealthy, he did his best to provide his children with an education of sorts. My mother was a woman of strong character. She had an oval face that was beautiful in its way. My father, on the other hand, had sharp, razor-like eyes, a well-built body, and muscular shoulders. I don't know what my mother saw in him. Perhaps she was attracted to his confidence and survival instincts. I do know that the local community was stunned when they started living together. Behind their backs, people called them Beauty and the Beast and wondered why she'd married such a terrible man. My grandmother once said to me, "Koreans are barbarians." I loved her, but I resented her remark. Though I felt Japanese, and felt it with complete conviction, I was half Korean, as she knew perfectly well. My mother's elder brothers, Shiro and Tatsukichi, occasionally made similar remarks. They'd been conscripted to serve in the Japanese army in Manchuria, and always described Koreans as poor and unkempt, like a bunch of gorillas. They never had the guts to say anything like that in front of my father, of course. But when my father wasn't around, Shiro would often say, "Miyoko had better divorce him as soon as possible. Koreans are just rotten to the core." Though I always felt a twinge of discomfort when he said such things, I couldn't help but agree with him. I had a strong sense of revulsion toward my father, who certainly lived up to the barbaric reputation of Koreans whenever he beat my mother. Given that we watched him torment her day after day, and that he frightened me and my sisters to death in the process, it was hardly surprising that I, like my grandmother, grew to dislike Koreans. My father used to strut about the neighborhood with 20 or 30 Korean followers in tow. He was one of the top dogs in the Korean community, and he enjoyed picking a fight with any Japanese who got on his nerves. He didn't care who it was. Special policeman? Sure. Military policeman? Bring it on. Koreans could depend on him for protection, but he scared the daylights out of Japanese people. My father always insisted on doing things his own way. After the end of the Second World War, he opened a black market street-side stall with several of his cronies. They sold canned food produced in the munitions factory where my father used to work, and sugar, flour, ship's biscuits, clothes, and other items procured illegally from American GIs. One day my dad and his buddies got into a huge brawl with American soldiers over the merchandise he was selling. He was notorious for a reason. Not that my father had many options. The Japanese defeat in World War II left 2.4 million Koreans stranded in Japan. They belonged to neither the winning nor the losing side, and they had no place to go. Once freed, they were simply thrown onto the streets. Desperate and impoverished, With no way to make a living, they attacked the trucks containing food intended for members of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces and sold the booty on the black market. Even those who'd never been violent before had little choice but to turn into outlaws. In a strange sort of way, all this illegality actually set these people free. During the war, they had only two grim choices. They could either become soldiers in their enemy's army, or slave away as civilian war workers. The soldiers would be sent to the front to be used as human shields against the shells. The laborers would be worked to the bone, and sometimes death, in coal mines or munitions factories. The life of an outlaw was a kind of liberation. At some point, my father joined what was then known as the General Association of Koreans in Japan, later to be known as the League of Korean Residents in Japan. This community for Koreans in Japan supported the principle of friendship between Japanese and Korean people and strove to help Koreans live a stable and regular life in Japan. But it wasn't as simple as it sounded. Ever since before the Second World War, many Koreans with permanent resident status in Japan had respected the Communist Party. Communist policies were anti-imperialist, and the party campaigned for the rights of Korean permanent residents. After the war, not long after the association was formed, a famous communist by the name of Kim Chon-hae was released from prison, along with several other Communist Party members. These individuals had remained defiant in prison and had refused to change their thinking. After their release, they had a powerful influence on the association, which naturally became more left-wing as a result. But the fundamental principle governing my father's behavior at that time had nothing to do with socialism. The important thing for him was nationalism. From my perspective, there wasn't much difference between a socialist movement, a nationalist movement, and a brutal brawl in the black market. All of these people had a couple of things in common. They all had their own personal histories in Japan, and they were all poor. They just wanted to assert their own existence, and that meant fighting however they could to gain some kind of power. Within the association, my father became known as Tiger. No surprise there. He had his action force of loyal street fighters, in reality a group of guys who'd get together in front of the old shop, make a fire in an iron basket, and slug back liquor all day. I don't know if they were discussing troubles in the black market or just waiting for their action force to be needed. But whenever something happened and their presence was called for, they'd spring into action and rush to the scene. In the end, everything fell apart for my father. The General Association of Korean Residents was deemed a terrorist group and ordered to disband in 1949. The League of Koreans in Japan served as a replacement for many, but times had changed. By then, public order had been restored, and someone like my father, an impulsive and poorly educated street fighter, simply wasn't needed anymore. What the newly launched league really needed at that time were skilled administrators. There was no place for my father, who couldn't even read in the new order. I can't help but wonder now whether his rejection from that group ultimately made him more vulnerable to the promises he started hearing about a great life to be had in North Korea. These days, I find more and more memories coming back to me. Sometimes I wish they wouldn't. I had 3 younger sisters, Eiko, Hifumi, and Masako, but we hardly ever lived together in Japan. Because our family was so poor, we were split up and sent to our relatives' houses so they could share the task of taking care of us, thereby lightening the burden. That changed in my final year of elementary school when we all moved to Nakano in Tokyo. My father had decided to get a job in the construction industry, or so he said. I do know that we had to move in a great rush. We didn't even have time to say goodbye to our neighbors, and we had to leave our beloved grandmother behind. Although I was initially worried about leaving everything I knew and moving to a place that I'd never seen, I was happy with our new life at first. We started living like a real family. We got up together in the morning and went to bed together at night. We ate dinner together, and we had family routines. Those little things meant so much to me. After all, the little things usually tie families together with the bonds of familial love. But that happy time was destroyed almost before it started. It wasn't long before my father's violence returned, worse than ever. Within weeks of our arrival, my father started drinking again, as soon as he returned home at the end of the day, and he went on drinking until his face settled into a dark scowl. When that happened, my mother would sequester my sisters and me in the adjoining room. We'd stand there helplessly and listen to the inevitable unraveling. The vicious sound of his voice as he ranted at our mother. The sound of his hitting her. The sound of his trying to stifle her tearful cries. The same thing happened night after night after night. I often couldn't understand what he was saying to her, but whatever it was, she never seemed to resist him. She just cried. Several times I tried to burst into the room to stop my father. I even bit his leg once, but he just kicked me to the ground. My mother would lie over me, protecting me with her body. Finally, my father would get bored, or so drunk he'd stagger out of the house and disappear into the night. And my mother, my sisters, and I would sit on the floor, weeping silently, huddled together. One night, one of the neighbors heard her screams and intervened. My father was caught off guard for a moment, but soon he seized the guy by the neck, forced him against the wall, and beat him senseless. No one ever came to our house after that. It just got worse from there. When my father returned home late at night, he'd wake my mother up just so that he could beat her yet again. And every night I was terrified when I saw his maniacal face. It was like looking into the face of a demon. I couldn't get to sleep. I just kept seeing that face. And if I did fall asleep, I'd have nightmares about it. Then came the worst night of all. It was autumn. I was 12 or 13. My father arrived home, blind drunk as usual, but this time he didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen and returned with a kitchen knife. He pressed it to my mother's neck and forced her outside. I knew I had to follow them. I hid behind a bush and watched as my father forced my mother up a steep hill pocked with craters. It had been quarried for earth and sand for use in the construction industry. I followed them in the darkness as my father forced my mother to the edge of a steep drop. I trembled with fear at the sight of the knife glinting in the dark night. He uttered a loud yell and then gave her a hard push. She howled as she stumbled backward, then toppled over the edge. My father just stood there for a moment, the knife still gleaming in his hand as he looked down from the top. Then he stomped off in the direction of our house. I raced to the hill, to the edge where I had seen my mother tumble. I couldn't make out how high it was, but I jumped over the edge anyway. Luckily, the soil was soft and I wasn't hurt. My mother lay there like a broken doll, her blouse soaked in blood. I hauled her up and held her screaming, "You mustn't die! Don't die on me! You can't go and die on me now!" Finally, she regained consciousness. As I hugged her, she said, "Masabo, I have to leave. He'll kill me if I don't. You have to be strong." I felt helpless and bereft as I clung to her. She was everything to me, the only kind person in my life, but I knew she had no choice. I helped her limp along through the darkness. I burst through the door at the hospital near the railway station and woke up the doctor. He was a kind man who treated her injuries without hesitation. Miraculously, she didn't need a single stitch. Later, we sat on a bench near the station, together, in silence, waiting for the first train of the day. Suddenly, my mother spoke. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll work hard and save some money, and then I'll come back for you and your sisters, so wait for me till then." And then she just wept, very quietly. Her face was thinner and paler than I'd ever seen it. She looked empty. I wanted to be strong, but there she was, covered in cuts and bruises, and there was nothing I could do about it. So I, too, began to cry, from sheer frustration and despair. Why did she have to go through such a terrible ordeal? Why did my father hate her so? She was so gentle and kind. It made no sense to me. When the train pulled into the station, my mother stood up, gave me a quick hug, and walked away. She turned and waved to me from the ticket barrier. Then I plodded back to our house. I felt numb, bewildered, and utterly alone. My father acted as if nothing had happened. To make matters worse, his mistress moved into the house shortly after my mother left. Her name was Kanehara, and she was Korean, like my father. She was wicked and cruel, especially toward my younger sisters, but my father never struck Kanehara. Not once. In fact, to my surprise, they seemed quite besotted with each other. They were constantly laughing and smiling at each other. Their behavior made me sick. I tried to be strong, but my sisters missed my mother desperately and cried every night. When they cried, Kanehara would slap them and berate them, which only made them miss my mother even more. I gave up going to school and instead scoured Tokyo every day looking for my mother. Every morning, I boarded the train and walked the streets for hours on end. This went on for half a year at least. I painstakingly searched every restaurant in the area, determined not to give up, and my efforts finally paid off. One afternoon, I spotted her through a restaurant window. Unable to move, I watched her as she scrubbed the table. Then I started to cry. I must have looked pretty suspicious to the restaurant owner, but he beckoned me in. I ran straight to my mother and hugged her. The restaurant owner kindly gave me something to eat, and suddenly the words came gushing out. I couldn't stop talking. I told my mother all about Kanehara, how she was living with us and how she was treating my sisters and how they missed her, and on and on. She smiled gently. "Be patient for a little while longer," she said. Then she gave me her necklace and gold ring. "If you have any trouble," she said, "take these to a pawnbroker, but don't talk to your father about me, okay? Don't tell him you've seen me. Don't tell him where I am." Now that I had found my mother, I started going to school again and went to see her almost every afternoon as soon as classes finished. Sometimes on the weekend or on public holidays, I took my younger sisters with me. The restaurant owner was very kind to us. I guess he knew our story. As for Kanehara, she could hit me all she liked because I truly believed that one day soon my mother would come back and rescue us. Looking back on it all, I think I can make sense of my father's frame of mind at the time, but I can't forgive him for what he did. In his heyday, he had 20 or 30 followers, and he was the boss, the main man, the godfather. In the black market, your birth and background meant nothing. You could be an ex-military man, you could be nobility, Japanese, Korean, it didn't matter. Your birth or background meant nothing. All that mattered was your physical strength, and my father knew how to live by violence. But later on, when the war ended and everything returned to normal, his physical strength no longer had any value. Suddenly, nationality and background meant everything. And in this new hierarchy, my father was nothing. He had no family connections by birth. Worse, he was Korean. That made it tough to get a job. When the General Association of Korean Residents was outlawed, his leadership role in his action force vanished. As his ex-comrades rose to lofty heights in the League of Koreans in Japan, he remained scrabbling about in the dirt with no prospects. So he took it out on my mother. Her family owned property of a kind, and she herself had a reasonable education, things he was hungry for but could never obtain himself. So she bore the brunt of all his anger toward the world. At first, I wondered why he never hit Kanehara. My guess is that it was because she was Korean and didn't serve as a constant reminder of all that he couldn't have. One thing I learned about this time was that while some people like my father, just like to show off their physical strength, others have a particular reason for being violent. In my final year of elementary school, my father decided that I should go to a Korean junior high school, even though I didn't speak Korean. I didn't want to go, but I was too scared to oppose his wishes, so off I went. Most of us at school came from poor families. Our poverty stemmed from racial discrimination, pure and simple. Most students never actively vented their frustration about this. They were just too busy trying to get by, but that didn't mean they took everything lying down. My schoolmates often had run-ins with Japanese people when they were playing outside or on their way home from school. Over time, they all came to associate racial discrimination with violence. And the logic was straightforward. If someone hit you, you didn't turn the other cheek. You hit them back. Twice as hard. I felt torn as I watched my classmates. Now that I'd shared a classroom with them for a while, I felt a growing kinship with them. I'd come to realize that my grandparents and other relatives were wrong. Koreans were nothing like the monsters they'd described. Oh, sure, they were rough. How could they not be? But they were also warm and kind. Although I still kept my distance from most of them, I started talking to a boy named Kan Tae-son, who sat next to me in class. The rest of us had closely cropped hair, but Son's hair was kind of unkempt, despite school rules. His hair resembled a mane that had earned him the nickname Lion. After Lion learned about my family situation, he invited me to come home with him one day. We walked through the maze of a Korean neighborhood near a confectionery factory, and the sweet smell of candy permeated the air. When we arrived at his house, his mother immediately asked me if I was hungry. A moment later, she rushed into the kitchen and re-emerged with rice, Korean pickles, and several other dishes. The table was soon filled with food. She kept saying, "Eat more," even though my mouth was full and I was practically choking on the rice I was wolfing down. Lion and his mother watched me, and I couldn't help noticing their smiles. I'd experienced maternal love, and of course I loved my sisters dearly, but this was the first time I'd felt real affection from people not related to me. Their warmth and empathy were palpable. To tell you the truth, I was so stunned I could barely swallow. From then on, Lion's house was the only place I could ever relax. Even as my life took its twists and turns, I never forgot his family's kindness. Once Lion and I had become friends, I felt more capable of talking to my classmates. But most of my classes were still totally incomprehensible to me since they were taught in Korean. Math made sense, as did science up to a point, but the rest was just gibberish. There were others like me who couldn't speak Korean at all, and you know what? Some teachers bent the rules and explained things to us in Japanese. Dissidents. We were taught that Kim Il-sung was the king who liberated Korea from colonialism. He'd waged the war against U.S. imperialists and their South Korean lackeys, and had won. It was thoroughly drummed into us that Kim Il-sung was an invincible general made of steel. I could tell the teachers were proud of his role as the great leader of an emerging nation. Around this period, Japan was hit by recession. Many companies went bankrupt, and unemployment rose sharply. Korean people were at the bottom of the pile, and circumstances that had merely been difficult before soon became dire for many families. Meanwhile, in North Korea, Kim Il-sung proclaimed he was building a socialist utopia. It was called the Cholima movement. Like the rest of us, our teachers were living in poverty, so they grasped at straws. There was this land, this promised land, a paradise on earth, a land of milk and honey, In their desperation, they fell for these claims and passed these lies on to us. I listened to what they said with half an ear at best. Oh, sure, there was this paradise on earth across the sea, but the here and now was all that mattered to me. How could I improve my life right now? Demonstrations were erupting in the streets. My family was barely scraping by, and we were constantly on edge. Added to that, Kanehara was still living with us, and my sisters and I were still sneaking off to see my mother every weekend. Given everything that was going on all around me daily, it was hard to care much about the paradise of North Korea. One day, about a year after my mother ran away, I came home to find a row of shoes lined up just inside the front door. I was stunned by what I found inside. Some guys were berating my father, and, most important, they were not being beaten to death. There was only one answer. They had to be bigwigs in the league. I entered the room unobtrusively and listened to their conversation. One of them said, "Look, if you can't clean up your act with regard to your wife, we'll break off our friendship with you." Another said, "We'll take things up with the league. Then you'll be screwed." One by one, they all laid into him. They thumped the tatami mats and raised their voices as they asked him to reflect on what he'd done and set out all the sordid details of his life. After an hour or so, satisfied that they had made their point, they all got up and left. My father and Kanehara also left, but I had no idea where they slunk off to. My father returned later that night alone. I do not know where Kanehara went. I never saw her again. A few days later, some guys affiliated with the league showed up at our door with my mother. I was so stunned by this turn of events, I could only look on in amazement. One of the fellows from the league prostrated himself in front of my mother. "Your husband has promised he'll mend his ways. Are you willing to start over with him? This isn't only about you. Think of the children," he said. My mother was dazed and speechless, but in the end, she agreed to return. Although my sisters shrieked with delight and excitement, I was worried sick. All I could think about was that my father would start beating her again. It was just a question of when. But a day went by. Nothing. A week. Then a month. Nothing. He never hit her again. Men from the league kept stopping by our house to make sure. It didn't end there. They also took my father to task about his lack of work. They'd come in and scold him relentlessly about it. "Look, you don't have a job. And what do? You get drunk all the time and make your wife's life a misery. But if you went there are jobs galore. Think of it. You'll get to send your kids to university." I didn't know where "there" was, but they repeatedly urged him to go back there. They talked and talked, sometimes till midnight and beyond. I could hear every word they said through the thin sliding door that separated my room from theirs. They were clearly discussing something that would change my life completely. Irrevocably. I was scared out of my wits at the thought of what it might be. Then, lo and behold, the same thing came up at school. "North Korea is your country. It's a paradise on earth. This is your chance. Go home." But North Korea wasn't my country. It had nothing to do with me. Why was my father being urged to return there? Kim Il-sung barked on about it in a speech we listened to at school on September 8, 1958, if my memory serves me correctly. Something along the lines of, "Our fellow countrymen living in Japan have no rights and are discriminated against. Because of that, they are suffering from the hardships of poverty, and they want to return to their mother country. We would like to welcome them back. The government of the People's Republic will ensure that they can start a new life when they come home. We will guarantee their living conditions." The expression, "return to North Korea," still didn't make sense to me. My father was from the southern part of Korea, not from North Korea. North Korea didn't exist when my father was born. Why would he return to a place he'd never known? After Kim Il-sung's statement, the General Association of Korean Residents started a mass repatriation campaign in the guise of humanitarianism. The following year, 1959, the Japanese Red Cross Society and the Korean Red Cross Society secretly negotiated a return agreement in Calcutta. 4 months later, the first shipload of returnees left the Japanese port of Niigata. Shortly after that, people affiliated with the League of Koreans in Japan started showing up on our doorstep, eager to persuade us to make the journey. They were all in favor of the mass repatriation. Did the International Committee of the Red Cross know anything about this? Did the United States? The UN? Yes, yes, and yes. And what did they do about it? Nothing. In the early days of the so-called repatriation, some 70,000 people left Japan and crossed the sea to North Korea. With the exception of a brief 3.5-year hiatus, the process continued until 1984. During this period, some 100,000 Koreans and 2,000 Japanese wives crossed over to North Korea. That's one hell of a mass migration. In fact, it was the first and only time in history that so many people from a capitalist country had moved to a socialist country. The Japanese government actively promoted the repatriation, supposedly on humanitarian grounds. But in my opinion, what they were actually pursuing was opportunism of the most vile and cynical kind. Look at the facts. During the period of the Japanese Empire, thousands upon thousands of Koreans had been brought to Japan against their will to serve as slave laborers and later cannon fodder. Now, the government was afraid that these Koreans and their families, discriminated against and poverty-stricken in the post-war years, might become a source of social unrest. Sending them back to Korea was a solution to a problem, nothing more. From the North Korean government's point of view, their country desperately needed rebuilding after the Korean War. What could be more convenient than an influx of workers? Kim Il-sung was desperate to prove to the world that the Democratic Republic was superior to South Korea. The prospect of thousands of Koreans returning home to serve as foot soldiers in the Great March Forward, as I call it, fueled his maniacal dreams. So yes, the mass repatriation was great news for both governments, the perfect win-win situation for everyone, except the real human beings involved. We were bombarded with a constant stream of infantile, almost hysterical pronouncements. Enjoy working and studying in North Korea, and North Korea is a paradise on earth. The League and the mass media were equally to blame. The bigwigs in the League were simply delusional. The journalists spectacularly naive. Oh, sure, they felt guilty about Japan's colonial past, but this guilt, far from sharpening their judgment, clouded their thinking and befuddled their critical faculties. I mean, this was the second half of the 20th century, for pity's sake, and they still saw communism as the road to utopia. I wonder if any of the people spouting these messages ever really grasped, in later years, the depths of misery for which they were responsible. Having said that, I'm not convinced that naive utopianism was the actual driving force behind people's decision to migrate. For most displaced Koreans living in Japan at the time, the key point was a much simpler promise. If you come back to your homeland, the government will guarantee you a stable life and a first-class education for your children. For the countless Koreans who were unemployed, underpaid, and laboring away at whatever odd jobs they could get, the abstract promises of socialism held far less sway than the hope for a stable life and a bright future for their children. Early one evening in 1959, When I walked in the door from school, my father announced, "We're going back to my country." I shook with anger and shock. "No way," I said. "I don't want to go." My heart was racing, and I turned to my sisters and my mother for help. My sisters weren't old enough to grasp what the conversation was about, so they just listened to us timidly as my father went on. "What do we have here to eat? Practically nothing. But if we go there, we'll have a steady life, something we've never had here." My mother broke in, her voice trembling. "But I can't speak Korean. How on earth am I going to live?" She sounded terrified, and I held out some hope that she'd stand up to him. But I also noticed she didn't say outright that she wouldn't go. My grandmother was furious when my mother and I went to tell her what my father had proposed. Apoplectic. "That's a terrible idea. You can't possibly be serious. All Koreans are barbarians, just like your husband. Besides, you and your children are Japanese. The North Koreans will hate you and abuse you. I just know this will end badly." I'd never seen her as angry as she was that day. When we got home, some creeps from the League were hovering about. They came to see my mother every day and gradually wore her down with their promises. They said things like, "If you go there, you'll never have another quarrel. Your children will be able to go to school for free, and after 3 years, you'll be able to come back to Japan for a visit." Wheedling creeps. I hated them. And in the end, they won. The bastards won. My mother agreed to go to North Korea with my father. I was astounded and distraught. What was my mother thinking? Why on earth did she decide to go with him? Was it love? After all he'd put her through? Or had she agreed out of some strange sense of duty? Did she actually buy the promise of a better life? I'll never know. Our departure was scheduled for January 1960. When the day finally came, my father, my mother, my sisters and I left our home for the last time and made our way to Shinagawa Station, where a large crowd had gathered. Though I knew better than to expect them, I scanned the crowd for a glimpse of my grandmother and my uncles and cousins, but they were nowhere to be seen. My grandmother had announced that she was done with my mother and would never speak to her again. I had nonetheless hoped that one of them, any of them, would come to say goodbye. A brass band played and marched in stiff, heroic formation as an ear-splitting din blasted out of a speaker above the crowd. Everywhere, people shouted, "Hooray!" My friend Lion pushed his way through the crowd. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me, his face streaming with tears. "Are you really going?" "I'll write to you, and I promise to come back someday." That was all I could manage to say. My stomach was twisted in knots. So many emotions were churning inside me as we boarded the train. When I looked back at him from my seat, his face was pale. I suddenly knew I'd never see him again. When the train started moving, a great cacophony of cheering and screaming seemed to come from everywhere. All at once, the adults on the train started crying. I wondered why. After all, they were going back to their homeland, so why were they sad? It seemed to portend bad things to come.